outset. United States, Great Britain or UK, Israel, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, at least at the outset, some of these other Gulf nations, against Syria, against Assad, and you had Russia, China, and Iran basically backing Assad and kind of warning us, hey, watch your step or maybe back off entirely. That, you're not going to topple Assad. We don't need that. Now, again, some of that, I believe, certainly, probably good cop, bad cop, what have you. But the point being that our own military, our own Pentagon, basically decided, theorized, came up with this idea, we can maybe form this radical Sunni terrorist organization that can weaken Assad in his own country and weaken his government. And you can read into this a little bit further, talking about they could declare an Islamic State through its union with other terrorist organizations in Iraq and Syria, talking about training them on the Iraqi side, in addition to harboring refugees in Syria or from Syria. All of this, again, theorized, strategized by our own Defense Department, by our own Defense Military Intelligence, by our own Pentagon. And you also have, skipping down here a little bit, leaked cables showing the United States plotting a Syrian overthrow. The one in charge of our embassy in Damascus in 2011, William Roebuck, and cables to Washington, which was uncovered by WikiLeaks. And yes, I do believe WikiLeaks themselves a psyop of some sort, but nevertheless, these were legitimate, in which Roebuck was talking about the vulnerabilities of Assad to Washington. Talking about how he was vulnerable in his alliance with Tehran, and possible action play on Sunni fears of Iranian influence within the country. In other words, getting Muslims stirred up against Muslim, and kind of getting the Syrian people maybe even stirred up against their own president, Assad. Now, who would this benefit, first of all? Well, it would benefit Israel. If you can weaken the Arab Muslim countries that are direct neighbors of Israel, if you can somehow topple or make their governments inept, then if you are aware at all of the so-called Greater Israel, and you look at what they want their borders to be, it includes part of Syria, it includes part of Iraq, it may have included part of Turkey, it certainly included part of Saudi Arabia, and basically where the Islamic State, so-called, where ISIS wanted to set up their state, their caliphate, was basically where Israel wanted to put Greater Israel, where Israel wanted to extend their borders. Now, keep in mind, again, indication number 2, ISIS never attacks Israel. And Micaiah Freeman writes, it is more than highly strange and suspicious that ISIS never attacks Israel. It is another indication that ISIS is controlled by Israel. If ISIS were a genuine and independent uprising that was not covertly orchestrated by the U.S., Israel, and again, I'll say the UK, why would they not try to attack the Zionist regime, which has attacked almost all of its Muslim neighbors ever since its inception in 1948? Israel has attacked Egypt, Syria, and Lebanon, and of course has decimated Palestine. It has systematically tried to divide and conquer its Arab neighbors. It continually complains of Islamic terrorism. Yet, when ISIS comes on the scene as the bloody and barbaric king of Islamic terrorism, again supposedly more ruthless than Al-Qaeda, it finds no fault with Israel and sees no reason to target a regime which has perpetrated massive injustice against Muslims. This stretches credibility to a snapping point. ISIS and Israel don't attack each other. They help each other. Israel was treating ISIS soldiers and other anti-Assad rebels in its hospitals. And there is a link associated with that. I had posted this on the American Faith Today Facebook page. I'll post it again. And the last point that I'll touch on here are a couple points. It talks about how ISIS has first-class social media skills. I think I've probably addressed that in the past. I know others have. That this supposedly uneducated or not very well educated kind of third world hates everything about the West, and yet they're so skilled on social media that Facebook and Twitter can't keep them off. Can't stop them from recruiting on their platforms. I mean, they can ban somebody temporarily or permanently for less extreme measures or conversation than certainly what ISIS would be doing, but they can't touch ISIS. That these guys are somehow able to stay one step ahead of Facebook and Twitter and so forth. ISIS is always the excuse for further intervention in any Middle Eastern nation. And also she mentions ISIS is an acronym for Mossad, the Israeli Secret Intelligence Service. Interesting coincidence, if you actually believe it's a coincidence. Another way to describe the Mossad, the shady Zionist spy agency, whose motto is by way of deception, thou shalt do war. So here you have Israel's neighbors that would be weakened by all of this fighting and civil war nonsense and what have you within neighboring states. You have Islamic extremist, Islamic terrorists that should hate the Zionist, Jewish, whatever, Talmudic government, nation of Israel that leaves them alone. And again, you have ISIS, that's an acronym actually for the Mossad. Again, motto, by way of deception, thou shalt do war. But let's touch a little bit more. Hopefully that's getting some brain cells, open-minded brain cells that maybe you weren't aware, active anyway. Let's touch a little bit more on this notion of ISIS and Israel not really being enemies. What happened, according to a former defense minister of the Israeli government? From a couple years ago, this has been on various websites. This happens to be richardsilverstein.com. A former Israeli defense minister confirms Israeli collaboration with ISIS in Syria. And again, the piece here mentions that Israel has Muslim allies like Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and the Gulf states. Sometimes it's an alliance of convenience, but there is that alliance with those other nations, and that they enjoy a tactic alliance with ISIS in Syria. This gentleman, Bogi Yalon, was a defense minister in the Israeli government until he had a falling out with actually Netanyahu in 2016. Afterwards, he tried to form his own political party and run for prime minister. He didn't get very far. He didn't have much support. But one of the things that he said was, within Syria, this is a direct quote from here, within Syria, there are many factions: the regime, Iran, the Russians, and even Al-Qaeda and ISIS. In such circumstances, one must develop a responsible, carefully balanced policy by which you protect your own interest on the one hand, and on the other hand, you don't intervene. Because if Israel does intervene on behalf of one side, it will serve the interest of the other, which is why we've established red lines. Anyone who violates our sovereignty will immediately feel the full weight of our power. On most occasions, firing or attacks comes from regions under the control of the regime, the Syrian government. But once the firing came from ISIS positions, and it immediately apologized. And variations of this quote, this statement, this claim, is that ISIS fired accidentally on the IDF and immediately apologized. The attack was reported in Israeli media, but ISIS's apology was not. It was suppressed, most certainly, Silverstein says, because an ISIS apology would embarrass both Israel and the Islamists, as it has now. Some critics claim that an ISIS apology doesn't signify an alliance or serious collaboration between the Islamist group and Israel, to which I reply, when you bomb an ally, you apologize. When you bomb an enemy, you don't. What does that make ISIS to Israel? Further, when was the last time an Islamist terror group apologized for firing bullets at Jews or Israelis? And again, as a rule, of course, they would not. They hate the Israeli nation. And yet, here we have this claim that they fired accidentally, inadvertently, on the IDF and immediately apologized. Now, let's talk about this individual, al-Baghdadi, or whatever you want to call him, whatever he wants to call himself. Couple different sites that I'll be drawing from as time allows. First of all, this guy has been reported dead almost half a dozen or about half a dozen times now. And in as much as we've drawn back and we've already had become kind of weakened in Syria anyway, in as much as we've supposedly drawn back and ceded control to Russia, and I know and I do think that I can see kind of the prophecy of Russia taking control in the Middle East from Daniel 11 verse 15, I believe, as some are saying. Russia basically is controlling some of the airspace, or a good portion of the airspace right now in Syria. And where we would have gone to, basically, from what is being reported, where we would have gone to basically have caught up to al-Baghdadi and ultimately killed him, we would have had to flown through that airspace, and Russia is saying there's absolutely no evidence that we were in their airspace or in that it's an area, I believe, of de-escalation right now. But there's no evidence from Russia or anybody else that we were even there. But again, this from veteranstoday.com, which I've mentioned I can't directly link, or I can't just post a link. Facebook won't allow it. But Gordon Duff, senior editor, who says, one might assert that accusing Israel of training agents to infiltrate Arab organizations is anti-Semitic. With this exception, they admit that not only do they do it all the time, but that this is a primary Mossad purpose. And again, I go back to what did I say about the Mossad, or what was the Mossad's motto, as reported, as shared by Micaiah Freeman here: by way of deception, thou shalt do war. Israeli operatives fill the ranks of Hamas and Hezbollah, ISIS, and Al-Qaeda. In some cases, dozens have been executed, but as had come to the surface in 2014, one stood out above the rest: Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, or as he had been exposed, Shimon Elliott, or Simon Elliott. Elliott, Simon, whatever you want to call it. Veterans Today broke the story. Others did as well, based on French reports and alleged confirmation by Edward Snowden that